In the final year of the Second World War, Japan's warlords finally saw the truth they had spent years denying. The nation that they once mocked as soft, indulgent, and weak had revealed a power that went far beyond battleships and bombers. It was the power of a nation unified by loss, driven by resolve, and capable of forging destruction and renewal in the same breath. When Japan's high command finally understood American power, it was not through words, but through fire, steel, and silence. The attack that stunned the world. 6 Japanese carriers under Admiral Nagumo launched more than 350 aircraft. In a span of 2 hours, the pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay burning. For Tokyo's high command, it was proof of their invincibility. The rising sun had humiliated a giant. Crowds cheered, generals toasted to a swift victory. But not everyone celebrated. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the attack, looked toward the horizon and uttered the words that history would never forget. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." In the first 6 months, that resolve was slow to rise. The Japanese Empire expanded from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands, from Burma to the edge of Australia. Their navy ruled supreme. Tokyo believed America would sue for peace, that the industrial society built on comfort would never endure a long, grinding war across oceans. But behind factory walls in Detroit, Seattle, and San Diego, something remarkable began. Men and women, millions of them, worked without rest. Factories that once made cars now made bombers. Typewriters became machine, gun parts. A nation united not by conquest but by the desire to never be humiliated again. By early 1942, America's shipyards were launching a new aircraft carrier every few months. Submarines, destroyers, tanks, planes, mass-produced with precision. Japan could not comprehend it. Their factories were small, their raw materials scarce, their industrial power limited by geography and blockade. Then came Midway, June 1942. 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagikaga, Seirit, and Hirit, were lost in one day. The cream of their naval air power was wiped out. When the news reached Tokyo, the high command sat in stunned silence. A few whispered that Yamamoto had been right. Others blamed fate. But deep down, they began to sense something changing. The Americans, they realized, could absorb catastrophe, learn, and return stronger than before. The Pacific now belonged to whoever could last longer, and America's capacity to endure seemed infinite. In 1943, as Japan clung to its island bastions, American forces began island hopping. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, each name carved into memory by blood. For every Japanese soldier, the order was the same: fight to the last man. And they did. Entire garrisons were annihilated, often with only a handful surrendering. But something else emerged on those islands. The grim realization among Japanese commanders that no matter how many Americans they killed, more would come. Always more. By 1944, the skies themselves began to darken with American planes. From newly captured islands, the B-29 superfortresses reached the heart of Japan. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka all became targets. One night in March 1945, over 300 bombers dropped incendiaries on Tokyo. In 6 hours, nearly 100 Zalozan civilians perished in the firestorm. The Imperial General Headquarters watched the city burn from underground bunkers. The reports that arrived were beyond comprehension. Entire districts had vanished. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, turned pale as he read the figures. "If this continues," he whispered, "there will be nothing left to defend." It was then that the High Command began to truly grasp the scale of American might. The U.S. was not just fighting, It was producing war on an industrial level. Its air force replaced losses faster than Japan could manufacture a single new engine. Its navy repaired ships in weeks that would take Japan months to rebuild. The Japanese government ordered reports on American industry, and what they found terrified them. In 1944 alone, the U.S. produced over 96,000 aircraft, while Japan produced barely 28,000. The numbers spoke for themselves. Still, Tokyo refused to surrender. They placed their faith in courage, spirit, and sacrifice. The kamikaze strategy was born, not as madness, but as desperation. Young men barely 20 volunteered for one-way missions. They believed they could stop the unstoppable. They were told that death for the emperor was honor beyond life itself. But deep within the Imperial Navy's staff, senior officers knew it would change nothing. For every ship sunk by a suicide plane, America built 5 more. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 brought the war home. American bombers were now within striking distance of Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tuja resigned soon after, his confidence broken. The emperor's advisors began to whisper words once unthinkable: negotiation, surrender, survival. Yet still, Japan fought on. Okinawa became the bloodiest proof of futility. April 1945, the Americans landed with overwhelming force: 500 ships, 180,000 troops, endless artillery. The battle lasted 82 days. Japanese defenders, civilians, and soldiers alike perished by the hundreds of thousands. The High Command watched reports come in: divisions wiped out, ammunition gone, the Navy shattered. A young naval officer recorded in his diary, "We are facing a storm of steel. There is no hope of victory, only the honor of endurance." In May, the combined fleet ceased to exist. Its flagship, the battleship Yamato, the largest in the world, was sunk by American aircraft before it even reached Okinawa's shores. More than 3,000 sailors went down with her. When the news reached Tokyo, silence again filled the war room. Admiral Toyota simply said, "So ends the Imperial Navy." Then came August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. The atomic age began. A single bomb, little boy, destroyed an entire city. Tens of thousands vaporized instantly. The Japanese High Command thought it was a conventional raid until reconnaissance reported the impossible. No city, no survivors, just a vast field of ash. 3 days later, Nagasaki. By August 9th, the Soviet Union had also declared war, invading Manchuria with 1.5 million troops. Japan's last hope, neutral mediation, collapsed overnight. In the Imperial War Council meeting that followed, generals debated one final time. Should Japan fight to extinction or surrender? Foreign Minister Taug pleaded for peace. War Minister Anami argued for one last battle on the home islands. Then, the emperor spoke. Calm, measured, final, he said. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. For the first time, the divine ruler of Japan broke the silence of centuries. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's voice reached the people. Japan had surrendered. The empire that had dreamed of eternal glory ended in ruins. When the Allied occupation began, American intelligence officers discovered captured documents, strategic assessments written by Japanese generals in the final months. They revealed not hatred, but awe. One admiral wrote, "America's strength lies not only in its machines, but in the unity of its people. They fight with purpose. They create faster than we can destroy." Another report read, "We believed spirit would conquer steel. We learned that spirit must have steel to endure." And in the quiet aftermath of surrender, those who survived understood what Yamamoto had foreseen years before Pearl Harbor. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its power was not in revenge, but in resolve. As U.S. troops entered Tokyo, they were met not with hatred, but exhaustion. Civilians bowed, soldiers laid down their arms. American officers expected resistance, but found only silence. The war was over. In the private diaries of surviving generals, reflections replaced rhetoric. One wrote, "We studied war as art, but they made it science. We prized death, but they valued endurance. That is why we are defeated." Within years, the same nation that once sought to conquer would rebuild under American guidance. Roads, industries, schools, all reborn from ashes. The paradox of history, the same power that destroyed Japan also helped it rise again. The High Command, many of them tried and sentenced, faced their fate with quiet resignation. Others, released years later, lived long enough to witness Japan's transformation into a democracy and an ally of the United States. In their twilight years, they wrote memoirs filled not with bitterness, but reflection. They understood now what America truly was, not an empire of territory, but an empire of production, unity, and relentless will. In the years leading up to the Pacific War, Japan's rise from isolation to militarism was not a sudden transformation. It was a slow burn fueled by pride, fear, and ambition. The empire's ruling class, descended from centuries of samurai tradition, viewed strength and sacrifice as the highest virtues. Defeat was not a word in their vocabulary. After the First World War, Japan emerged as one of the major powers, its economy industrializing rapidly and its navy ranking among the world's strongest. Yet beneath this progress lay a growing resentment. The Western powers, particularly the United States and Britain, had long treated Japan as an inferior partner. The 1924 U.S. Immigration Act, which barred Japanese immigration, deeply humiliated Tokyo. Newspapers at the time described it as an insult to the Japanese spirit. It planted a seed of bitterness that would one day grow into full-blown hostility. As the global economy collapsed during the Great Depression, Japan's export-driven system began to falter. Rice prices plummeted, factories shut down, and unemployment soared. In the countryside, farmers starved while urban elites debated parliamentary politics. Out of this chaos emerged a new force, military officers who promised revival through conquest. They spoke of the Showa Restoration, a return to national purity and martial virtue under the emperor. Civilian leaders who called for moderation were silenced, sometimes with bullets. In 1932, Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi was assassinated by naval officers for opposing aggression in China. His death marked the end of civilian control. From then on, the generals and admirals ruled through fear and ideology. The military began shaping Japan's future with a vision they called the Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere. On paper, it was presented as liberation for Asia from Western colonialism. In truth, it was a dream of dominance. Japan at the center, ruling over an empire of subjugated nations. The soldiers who marched into Manchuria in 1931 believed they were fulfilling destiny. They created a puppet state called Manchukuo and placed the last Chinese emperor, Puyi, on its throne. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but Japan ignored the protests and withdrew from the organization entirely in 1933. The message was clear: Japan would no longer play by Western rules. It would write its own. Within the imperial army, a fierce belief took hold that moral superiority could overcome material weakness. Officers trained their men not merely to fight, but to die. They preached that surrender was dishonor, that self-sacrifice was the ultimate proof of loyalty. 100 million hearts beating as one. The slogan went. This doctrine of spiritual strength, Seishin, became the foundation of Japan's war strategy. The Americans, they believed, lacked such spirit. They saw them as comfortable, mechanized, and dependent on machines. Japanese commanders taught that the West had grown soft, incapable of enduring hardship. In contrast, Japanese soldiers could fight barefoot, survive on a handful of rice, and still prevail. By the late 1930s, this ideology merged with ambition. Japan needed resources, oil, steel, rubber, to sustain its growing war machine, the U.S. And Britain controlled most of those supplies in Southeast Asia. When Japan invaded China in 1937, launching what would become a brutal 8-year war, the world reacted with outrage. Reports of atrocities in Nanking and other cities spread across the globe, hardening American attitudes. Yet inside Japan, propaganda painted these conquests as heroic acts of liberation. The population was told that Japan was destined to lead Asia out of Western oppression. As tensions with the United States deepened, American sanctions cut off vital exports, especially oil. By 1941, Japan's stockpile could sustain its navy for only a year. The High Command faced a choice: yield to Western pressure or strike first. To yield meant humiliation, something the samurai spirit could never accept. To strike meant war against an industrial giant. And so, driven by the illusion of moral superiority and the desperation for survival, Japan made its fateful choice. On the eve of the Pearl Harbor attack, many officers toasted to destiny. They believed one swift, decisive blow would break American will. They believed that spirit would conquer steel. None of them imagined that this single act would awaken a nation whose strength was not in pride or tradition, but in unity, ingenuity, and resolve. It was a misjudgment born from decades of isolation and arrogance, one that would lead Japan, step by step, into the fires of 1945. Within the polished halls of the Imperial Navy, behind the disciplined faces and precise salutes, a silent war of ideology and pride simmered long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Japan's navy, modeled after the British Royal Navy, had once been the jewel of the empire, sleek, professional, and proud. Its admirals dressed in crisp, white uniforms and believed they carried the honor of centuries of samurai heritage on their shoulders. But as the empire grew bolder, the navy itself became divided between two powerful factions: those who sought moderation and diplomacy, and those who believed Japan's destiny lay in total domination of the Pacific. This divide would shape every decision, every gamble, and ultimately, every tragedy that followed. At the center of this conflict stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man both respected and distrusted by his peers. A veteran of the Russo-Japanese War and a Harvard-educated strategist, Yamamoto understood America in ways few others did. He had seen the factories of Detroit, the oil refineries of Texas, the limitless horizon of American industry. He knew that if Japan went to war with the United States, the odds were hopeless. In the first 6 months of war, he once said, "I will run wild. But after that, I cannot promise success." His warning was both prophecy and plea, but it fell on deaf ears. The Navy General Staff, driven by arrogance and years of propaganda, believed America lacked the resolve to fight. They mistook economic comfort for weakness and democracy for fragility. They did not see that behind every American comfort was a vast engine of production and willpower. While Yamamoto planned reluctantly, others like Admiral Osami Nagano and Vice Admiral Cheta Ichi Nagumo pushed for a decisive first strike. They saw war as inevitable and believed Japan's only chance was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one swift, devastating blow. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a military decision. It was a gamble with history itself. The Imperial Navy's officers were confident. They had trained their carrier pilots to near perfection, mastering torpedo drops in shallow waters and coordinating mass aerial strikes with precision. When the plan succeeded beyond expectation on that December morning, Tokyo erupted in celebration. Admiral Nagumo's name was cheered in the streets. The Navy believed it had changed the course of the war before it had even begun. But Yamamoto, upon hearing the news, remained silent. He knew the Americans. He had seen the way they responded to challenge. As his subordinates celebrated, he wrote in his diary, "I feel that all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." He understood that Japan's victory was an illusion, an emotional triumph, not a strategic one. The U.S. had lost ships, but its aircraft carriers, the true heart of naval warfare, had survived. And more importantly, the Americans had been unified overnight in a fury unlike anything Japan could imagine. As months passed, the cracks within the Imperial Navy widened. Yamamoto, now commander of the combined fleet, pushed for further offensive actions to force the Americans into a decisive naval battle. His plan led to Midway. It was to be Japan's second great strike, a trap that would annihilate the U.S. carrier fleet once and for all. But intelligence, overconfidence, and misjudgment collided in disaster. The Americans, having broken Japan's naval codes, knew Yamamoto's plan in advance. On June 4, 1942, in the waters north of Midway Atoll, American dive bombers struck with surgical precision. Within minutes, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sea Right, and Hirit, were engulfed in flames. More than 3,000 sailors and dozens of Japan's most skilled pilots perished. It was a loss from which the Imperial Navy would never recover. When the news reached Tokyo, the atmosphere inside naval headquarters turned cold. The same officers who once toasted victory now stood in silence. Yamamoto did not speak of failure. He knew it was already written. For Japan, Midway was not merely a battle lost. It was the beginning of the end. Yet, in the months that followed, many admirals refused to accept it. They clung to pride, blaming luck or divine misfortune instead of flawed strategy. They ignored the truth that Yamamoto had warned them about from the start: America's ability to learn and rebuild faster than any enemy in history. By 1943, the rivalry between the Navy's strategists and the Army's land commanders deepened. The Navy demanded resources for carriers and ships. The Army demanded reinforcements for China and Burma. Supplies dwindled, fuel became scarce, and Japan's once powerful fleet began to rust in its harbors. When Yamamoto was killed in 1943, shot down by American fighters in a targeted interception known as Operation Vengeance, his death symbolized more than the loss of a leader. It was the death of reason within Japan's command. Without him, reckless admirals pursued hopeless engagements, sending ships and men into battles they could not win. Inside the war rooms of Tokyo, morale faded. Reports of lost ships, sunken convoys, and starving sailors piled up. Officers who had once spoken proudly of samurai honor now whispered of fate. The Imperial Navy, once Japan's greatest source of pride, had become its greatest tragedy, a force blinded by belief in spiritual superiority, undone by the cold precision of industrial power. They had built their strategy on the courage of men, not the capacity of machines. In the end, that faith would prove fatal, as America's steel tides closed in from every horizon, and the once invincible fleet of the rising sun vanished beneath the Pacific waves. The Battle of Okinawa began under a sky heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves mourned what was about to unfold. It was April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday in the West, but for Japan, it marked the beginning of the end. The island of Okinawa, the largest in the Ryukyu chain, was the last barrier between the advancing Americans and the Japanese mainland. To the Imperial High Command, it was sacred ground, a final wall that had to hold at any cost. To the Americans, it was the stepping stone for the invasion of Japan. The scale of what followed would dwarf everything before it. A battle that would turn paradise into hell. From the sea came an armada unlike any the world had ever seen. Over 500 American ships filled the horizon, carrying nearly 500,000 soldiers, Marines, and sailors. Battleships the size of cities fired their guns day and night, turning mountains into dust. The Japanese defenders, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, watched from their tunnels and caves. They had no illusions of victory. The High Command had ordered them to delay the inevitable, to bleed the enemy so heavily that the Americans would fear invading the homeland. The defense plan was grim: no counterattacks, no frontal assaults, only attrition. The soldiers of the 32nd Army were told that their deaths would buy time for Japan's salvation. Many bowed before the imperial portrait one last time, then sealed themselves inside underground bunkers carved into the limestone hills. For the Americans landing on the beaches, the initial silence was eerie. The first waves met little resistance. Some believed the enemy had fled, but it was deception. The Japanese had dug deep into the ridges of Shuri and Maeda, constructing miles of tunnels, machine gun nests, and artillery chambers hidden beneath the earth. When they finally opened fire, the island exploded with fury. Mortars, grenades, and artillery rained down, shredding men and machines alike. The battle that had begun with optimism descended into madness. Day by day, rain mixed with blood turned the fields into rivers of mud. The stench of death filled the air. American and Japanese bodies alike bloated under the tropical sun. Civilians, caught between both sides, suffered unspeakably. Many Okinawan families, brainwashed by Japanese propaganda, believed the Americans would torture and kill them. Entire groups committed suicide, mothers throwing their children from cliffs before jumping after them. Soldiers, out of ammunition, charged with bayonets or chose to end their own lives with grenades clutched to their chests. To the Imperial Army, surrender was unthinkable. To live while the Emperor's army died was shame beyond redemption. Inside the Japanese command tunnels, General Ushijima maintained a calm dignity. His chief of staff, General Cho, was the firebrand, urging banzai charges and suicidal resistance. But Ushijima was pragmatic. He knew defeat was certain. Still, he obeyed orders to fight to the last. As American forces closed in on the Shuri line, the Japanese positions collapsed one by one. Each night, the horizon glowed red from bombardments so intense that even veterans of Tarawa and Iwo Jima called it the worst they had seen. American soldiers, too, were broken by what they witnessed. The cries of wounded men echoing through caves, the sight of civilians dead by their own hand. It left scars deeper than the battle itself. By June, the Imperial High Command in Tokyo knew Okinawa was lost. Reports described catastrophic losses. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians dead. The Americans had suffered over 50,000 casualties, but they had taken the island. When the Emperor was briefed, he reportedly fell silent, understanding now what awaited the mainland. For the generals in Tokyo, Okinawa confirmed their worst fear. America's capacity to endure suffering far exceeded their imagination. The Americans fought not just with weapons, but with relentless, methodical persistence. No amount of courage or sacrifice could stop them. On June 22, 1945, with his forces annihilated and his lines overrun, General Ushijima gathered his remaining officers at a cave overlooking the sea. He bowed toward the imperial palace in Tokyo and committed seppuku, his final act of loyalty. His staff followed. When American troops later entered the cave, they found his body lying peacefully beside his sword, a symbol of a nation's tragic devotion to honor over life. The Battle of Okinawa left an indelible mark on both sides. The Japanese command finally understood that the Americans would fight for as long as it took, regardless of the cost. The loss of Okinawa meant that Japan itself lay exposed, with no natural defenses left. It was a turning point not only in strategy but in realization. In the corridors of Tokyo's bunkers, senior officers whispered that if the Americans invaded the mainland, millions would die. And yet, even then, the military clung to the belief that mass sacrifice could force negotiation. They were wrong. Okinawa had proven that America would not stop, not until the rising sun itself fell below the horizon forever. By the summer of 1945, Tokyo was no longer the shining imperial capital that had once stood as a symbol of Japan's destiny. The great wooden city, filled with narrow streets and paper-walled homes, had become a smoldering wasteland. The American B-29 bombers, flying from bases in the Mariana Islands, came by the hundreds each night, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. What began as precise attacks on military targets turned into an inferno of strategic bombing. In March, the firebombing of Tokyo killed over 100 Zalozan civilians in a single night, more than either of the atomic bombings that would follow. It was a city consumed by fire and smoke, a sea of red beneath black skies. Children wandered through ashes searching for their families. Entire districts vanished overnight. Yet even as flames devoured the empire's heart, the Japanese high command refused to surrender. They believed that suffering proved strength, that pain itself could be weaponized into resolve. Inside the imperial palace's underground war room, the atmosphere grew tense, desperate, and detached from reality. The imperial general headquarters, comprised of senior army and navy officers, met daily, their uniforms pristine, their discussions detached from the chaos above. The Navy, already shattered at Leyte Gulf and Midway, could no longer protect the homeland. The Army, stretched thin across China, Manchuria, and the Pacific Islands, was starving and broken. Still, men like General Anami Korechika and General Yumizu Yoshijiro insisted that Japan could mount a decisive homeland defense. Operation Ketsugo was their plan, a suicidal strategy to repel the expected American invasion through sheer willpower. Millions of civilians were being trained with bamboo spears and Molotovs. Schoolgirls drilled in fields. Old men were issued rifles from the Russo-Japanese War. The government told the people that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. And yet, behind closed doors, even the most loyal officers knew the truth. Japan was finished. In July 1945, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The terms were clear: surrender or face, prompt and utter destruction. Within the Japanese high command, the message ignited fierce debate. The moderates, led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, urged acceptance. The hardliners, especially within the army, rejected it outright. They believed the Americans were bluffing, that the United States had no means to invade so soon after Okinawa's heavy casualties. Others still clung to a fragile hope that the Soviet Union, still neutral, might mediate peace on favorable terms. That illusion shattered on August 8th, when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. The once proud Kwantung Army, Japan's most elite force, was crushed in days by overwhelming Soviet armor and artillery. The empire was collapsing from every direction. 2 days earlier, on August 6th, the world had changed forever. A single B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, flew above Hiroshima and released the first atomic bomb. Little boy. Within seconds, a blinding white flash erased the city. A fireball hotter than the sun incinerated buildings, people, and everything within 2 miles. Tens of thousands vanished instantly. Those who survived the blast staggered through the ruins, their skin melted, their shadows burned into the ground. The Japanese military initially refused to believe it was a single bomb. They thought Hiroshima had been struck by a massive incendiary raid. But American intelligence broadcasts confirmed what Tokyo feared: a new weapon of unimaginable power had been unleashed. When the second bomb fell on Nagasaki on August 9th, any remaining illusions crumbled. The Japanese War Cabinet convened in an emergency meeting that lasted through the night. For the first time, Emperor Hirohito himself spoke directly to his ministers. In a calm, quiet voice, he said that continuing the war would only lead to the total extinction of the Japanese people. His words cut through the silence like a blade. The generals lowered their heads, some in shame, others in defiance. General Anami, torn between loyalty and reality, wept as he signed the surrender decision, knowing it meant the end of everything his generation had fought for. The High Command's vision of divine victory had collapsed in the face of human annihilation. Yet even then, not all accepted defeat. In the early hours before the emperor's surrender broadcast, a group of officers attempted a coup, hoping to seize the imperial palace and prevent the announcement. They failed, and by dawn, the emperor's recorded voice echoed across the empire for the first time. "Endure the unendurable," he said. For millions of Japanese citizens listening in shattered cities, it was the voice of a god asking his people to live, not die. The war was over, though few could yet grasp what that meant. In the final hours before surrender, inside what remained of the imperial headquarters, silence filled the once busy war rooms. Maps of the Pacific still hung on the walls, red pins marking islands that no longer mattered. The officers stood motionless as the emperor's decision became known. Some bowed deeply, others drew their swords and ended their lives. Outside, Tokyo was still smoldering. In that silence, Japan's high command finally understood American power. Not just the bomb, not just the armies and fleets, but the relentless will of an industrial giant that had mobilized an entire nation to wage total war. It was a force beyond imagination, a storm that had swept away an empire built on pride. In the weeks following Japan's surrender, the empire's once mighty military machine lay in ruins. The proud soldiers who had sworn to die for the emperor now stood unarmed, their uniforms tattered, their faces hollow. Across the shattered islands, American occupation forces arrived, not as conquerors drunk with victory, but as silent witnesses to devastation. The cities were rubble, the people broken, and the spirit of the nation hung in a fragile balance between shame and relief. Tokyo, once a hub of command and ambition, had become a ghost of itself, streets littered with ash and twisted steel, the imperial palace surrounded by silence instead of ceremony. The war was over, yet its echoes lingered in every heart and every ruin. Within the remnants of the imperial high command, the surviving generals faced the reckoning they had long avoided. In the underground chambers where war plans had once been drawn with fanatical precision, they now sat before Allied officers, questioned about the decisions that had brought Japan to ruin. Some spoke calmly, others refused to speak at all. Many could not comprehend how completely the world had changed. They had believed in spiritual strength, in divine destiny, in the idea that Japan's purity of purpose could overcome material inferiority. But now they faced an enemy who had rebuilt faster, fought harder, and harnessed science in ways that defied imagination. American power was no longer an abstract threat. It was a reality carved into the burned cities and shattered fleets of the empire. Admiral Yonai, one of the few who had opposed the war, described the mood among his peers after the surrender. "It was as if the sun had set forever," he said. "We had built our world upon illusions, and they burned with the cities." The surviving officers of the Imperial Navy were among the most stunned. They had watched their carriers and battleships, the symbols of national pride, vanish beneath the Pacific waves. At first, they had believed that courage could equal technology, that devotion could outmatch industry. But now, seeing American warships anchored in Japanese bays, their decks lined with planes and sailors, they realized how deeply they had misjudged the scale of their opponent. The Americans had built ships faster than Japan could sink them, trained pilots faster than Japan could bury hers, and turned entire cities into engines of war. General Anami Korechika's suicide after the surrender had already set a grim tone for the military's final days. He had left a note: "I, with my death, apologize to the Emperor for the great crime." That sentiment rippled through the surviving officer corps. The shame of defeat, more than the fear of punishment, consumed them. Yet beneath that shame was a strange respect for the Americans they had fought. Reports circulated among the Japanese staff about how U.S. forces treated civilians with unexpected restraint, how they delivered food instead of vengeance, how they rebuilt instead of destroyed further. For many officers, it was the first time they saw the true meaning of power, not domination, but discipline. In the months that followed, as General Douglas MacArthur oversaw the occupation, Japan's leaders were forced to confront their past. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal brought generals, ministers, and admirals to trial. In the courtroom, the myths of divine war crumbled beneath the weight of evidence. Massacres, forced labor, civilian atrocities. Some officers defended themselves as patriots, others admitted their guilt. Emperor Hirohito, though shielded from prosecution, became a living symbol of the empire's transformation. His divine image was stripped away. He became a man among men, addressing his people in humility rather than command. For the first time in centuries, Japan began to see itself not as a God-blessed empire, but as a nation among nations. For the ordinary soldiers who returned home, there were no parades, no celebrations. Many found their families gone, their villages destroyed. Some wandered the countryside in tattered uniforms, haunted by memories of friends lost to jungles and oceans. American occupation troops observed them quietly, sometimes offering food or cigarettes. The bitterness faded slowly, replaced by something more enduring: understanding. Through hunger and loss, the Japanese people learned that the Americans they had once imagined as monsters were human too. That realization did not erase the past, but it began to heal it. In the private diaries of several surviving officers, one sentiment appeared again and again: awe. Awe not at the atomic bomb alone, but at the sheer coordination, intelligence, and industrial might that had made America unstoppable. They wrote of endless convoys, of aircraft carriers appearing faster than they could be sunk, of bombers that flew higher and longer than they thought possible. It was not brute strength that defeated Japan. It was organization, innovation, and willpower. The Americans had treated war as science, not spirit, and in that revelation, Japan's high command finally grasped the lesson they had ignored for decades. Power is not found in arrogance or faith, but in understanding, preparation, and unity of purpose. Years later, as Japan rose again, this time not through conquest, but through industry and peace, many of those same men would reflect on the irony. The very qualities they had underestimated in America, discipline, resilience, and innovation, became the foundation of Japan's rebirth. In the ashes of defeat, they had finally understood the true nature of power. Not the kind that destroys nations, but the kind that rebuilds them. In the end, it was not the bomb, nor the battles, that broke Japan's will. It was the understanding of what America had become, a nation forged in the fire of war, tempered by freedom, and driven by a strength that could not be measured in numbers alone.